The old warrior sat in the dim light of the Academy's briefing room. His 4 arms bore scars from countless battles across the galaxy. His thick gray skin showed patches where armor had been fused to flesh by plasma fire. The young cadets before him had never seen anything like Vex Tai, a veteran of 50 campaigns who had conquered worlds that others deemed impossible to take. But when he spoke of humans, something changed in his yellow eyes. They grew distant and haunted, as if remembering something that should not exist in this ordered universe. The cadets leaned forward, eager to hear tales of glory and conquest. What they would hear instead would haunt their dreams for years. Come. Vexthai's voice was rough like grinding stone when he began. 3 cycles ago, the Galactic Coalition received reports from the Outer Rim territories. Scouts had discovered a new species on a blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The intelligence reports were encouraging. These creatures had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Their technology was primitive, their military forces were scattered and unorganized. They called themselves humans. The Coalition Council was pleased. New species meant new worlds to add to their empire, new resources to exploit, new populations to control. The humans would be like all the others. They would see the might of the Coalition fleet and surrender quickly. They would accept their place in the galactic order. They would become another footnote in the endless expansion of civilization. Vex Thai had been chosen to lead the advance reconnaissance force. His record was perfect. 47 successful first contacts, 47 species that had seen his fleet and immediately understood their situation. His ship, the Eternal Victory, carried 50,000 elite soldiers, the best warriors from across the Coalition, veterans who had never known defeat. The human presence in their system was minimal. 1 small outpost on their moon, perhaps 300 individuals total, scientists and miners mostly. The tactical assessment was simple. The humans would surrender within hours of the Coalition arrival. If not, the outpost could be destroyed with a single plasma bombardier. Either way, the path to Earth would be clear. Vexathai paused in his telling. His mandibles clicked nervously. The cadets noticed his upper left arm trembling slightly. Whatever came next had shaken this legendary warrior to his core. The Eternal Victory dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. Sensors immediately detected the human outpost on the lunar surface. It was even smaller than intelligence had suggested, a collection of simple domes and mining equipment. The human ship in orbit was barely worthy of the name, a cargo vessel with basic defensive systems. Vexthai opened communications and delivered the standard ultimatum. The humans had 1 hour to surrender unconditionally. They would be treated fairly under Coalition law. Their technology and resources would be cataloged and redistributed. Resistance would result in total annihilation. The response came immediately. A human male appeared on the communication screen. He was young, perhaps in his 3rd decade. Brown hair, brown eyes, unremarkable in every way except for his expression. Where Vexthai expected fear, he saw something else entirely, something that made the veteran warrior's blood run cold. The human smiled. His name was Jake Martinez, and he was the outpost commander. He listened politely to Vexthai's demands, nodded thoughtfully, and then delivered a response that would echo through Coalition military academies for generations. "Thank you for the offer," Jake Martinez said calmly. "We'll have to decline. This is human territory now, and we don't give up what's ours. You're welcome to try and take it, but I should warn you. We've been waiting for someone like you to show up. We've had time to prepare." The communication ended. Vexathai stared at the blank screen for several long moments. In his entire career, no species had ever refused the initial surrender demand. Fear was universal. Self-preservation was the most basic instinct of all intelligent life. What he had just witnessed should have been impossible. The orbital bombardment began within minutes. The human ship was destroyed quickly, as expected. But the moon base was shielded better than intelligence had suggested. It took 3 full volleys to breach the outer defenses. When the shields finally fell, Vexthai ordered the landing forces to deploy. 2,000 elite troops descended to the lunar surface. Their mission was simple: secure the facility, capture any survivors for interrogation, establish a forward base for the assault on Earth. The entire operation should have taken less than 6 hours. It took 6 days. The humans had turned their mining facility into a fortress. Every corridor was trapped. Every room was a potential ambush site. The mining equipment had been converted into weapons that coalition forces had never encountered. Explosive devices crafted from mining charges, barriers made from smelted metal ore, communication systems that somehow interfered with coalition battle networks. But it was not the technology that unnerved Vexthai's forces. It was the humans themselves. They fought like nothing in coalition records. When surrounded, they did not surrender. When outnumbered, they did not retreat. When wounded, they continued fighting. They used tactics that made no logical sense. Single individuals would hold positions against entire squads, not to achieve victory, but simply to delay the inevitable for a few more hours. Jake Martinez became a legend among the human defenders. He seemed to be everywhere at once, leading counterattacks down maintenance tunnels, setting up defensive positions in equipment bays, coordinating resistance through communication systems that coalition intelligence could not crack. For 6 days, he turned 300 miners and scientists into a military force that held off 50,000 elite soldiers. On the final day, Vexthai led the assault on the command center personally. His forces had lost over 800 troops, taking a facility that should have fallen in hours. The final corridor leading to the human command post was the most heavily defended position in the entire outpost. Jake Martinez held it alone. For 6 hours, one human with improvised weapons and mining explosives kept an entire battalion at bay. He used shaped charges to collapse sections of the corridor. He rerouted atmospheric systems to create smoke screens. He somehow managed to hack coalition tactical frequencies and fed false information to attacking units. When the coalition forces finally breached his position, they found something that would haunt Vexthai for the rest of his life. Jake Martinez had died standing up. His body was propped against a control panel, one hand still gripping the detonator for a final explosive device. He had died of blood loss from multiple wounds, but he had never fallen. Even in death, he maintained his post. His eyes were still open, still defiant, still challenging any who would dare to take what was his. But it was not the sight of the dead human that broke something inside Vexthai. It was what Jake Martinez had been protecting. The command center contained no weapons, no secret technology, no strategic resources. It contained a communication array and recorded messages, messages to Earth, messages to other human colonies. Messages that simply said, "We held them. We held them as long as we could. They're coming for you next. Be ready." Jake Martinez had not been fighting to win. He had not been fighting to survive. He had been fighting to warn others, to buy time, to ensure that his death would mean something. Vexthai realized with growing horror that the humans had not been trying to defend territory. They had been defending an idea, something that his species in 2,000 years of conquest had never encountered before. They called it freedom, and they would rather die than lose it. Vexthai's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued his tale. The cadets noticed how his claws gripped the edge of the table, leaving deep scratches in the metal surface. What came next in his story would explain why the Coalition had nightmares about a small blue planet in the outer rim. After the lunar outpost incident, the Coalition Council made a decision that would haunt the galaxy for generations. They decided that the humans had simply been lucky. One man's desperate last stand meant nothing in the grand scope of galactic conquest. The real test would come when they faced Earth itself. The Coalition assembled the largest invasion fleet in their history. 200 warships carried 2 million of their finest soldiers. The fleet stretched across space like a metal constellation, bristling with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand the fury of stars. Surely no primitive species could stand against such overwhelming force. Intelligence reports suggested that Earth's population was scattered across multiple continents with no unified command structure. Their military forces were divided into separate nations that often fought among themselves. Their space fleet consisted of converted cargo vessels and experimental prototype ships. By every tactical measure, the planet should fall within days. The human fleet met them at the edge of their solar system. Vexthai paused, his yellow eyes growing distant as he remembered that first glimpse of human space forces. They came in, ships that barely qualified as military vessels, cargo haulers with armor plating welded to their hulls, mining ships carrying missile pods clearly designed for asteroid work, scientific research vessels that had been hastily converted into fighters. Leading them was a vessel called Freedom's Edge, commanded by a human female named Lisa Stone. Her ship was little more than engines strapped to a reactor core with a crew. Compartments somehow fitted between them. Coalition sensors could barely detect any defensive systems at all. It should have been destroyed by the first volley from any coalition cruiser. Instead, Lisa Stone did something that defied all military logic. She charged directly at the coalition flagship. The massive coalition dreadnought opened fire with everything it had. Plasma cannons that could vaporize asteroids, particle beams that could slice through moon-sized targets, energy weapons that had conquered 100 worlds. The human ship should have been obliterated instantly. But Freedom's Edge kept coming. Lisa Stone had done something that coalition engineers said was impossible. She had rerouted her ship's life support systems to feed power directly into the engines. Her crew was slowly suffocating, but their vessel was moving faster than any ship of its size had any right to move. The coalition weapons tracked targets based on predictable flight paths and logical tactical decisions. There was nothing logical about what Lisa Stone was doing. Her ship slammed into the flagship's primary shield generator at a speed that turned both vessels into expanding clouds of superheated plasma. The explosion was visible from Earth's surface. But in that moment of destruction, Lisa Stone had created a gap in the coalition formation that the rest of the human fleet poured through like water through a broken dam. The space battle that followed lasted 18 hours. When it was over, the coalition fleet had lost 37 ships and nearly a quarter of their fighting strength. The humans had lost twice as many vessels, but they had achieved something impossible. They had forced the coalition fleet to retreat to the outer system and regroup. More disturbing than their tactical success was their complete disregard for acceptable losses. Human commanders would sacrifice entire squadrons to destroy single coalition vessels. They rammed damaged ships into enemy formations rather than attempt repairs. They used their own vessels as missiles when conventional weapons ran out of ammunition. But the real nightmare began when the coalition forces reached the planet's surface. Standard occupation protocol was simple and had worked on every world the coalition had ever conquered. Destroy the government centers, control the communication networks, establish military presence in major population areas. The local population would see the futility of resistance and accept their new situation. Earth was different. When coalition forces landed in the major cities, they found that the humans had already evacuated their government leaders to hidden locations. When they took control of communication systems, backup networks immediately activated from sources they could not locate. When they established control over population centers, they discovered that every human civilian was a potential resistance fighter. An old man named Pete Johnson had converted his farming equipment into mobile artillery. His tractors had been fitted with missile launchers designed for crop-dusting aircraft. His harvesting machines had been turned into mobile bunkers that could appear from grain fields, fire on coalition convoys, and disappear back into the agricultural landscape before return fire could be coordinated. A school teacher named Mary Collins had organized her students into a communication network that stretched across entire continents. Children who should have been learning basic mathematics were instead building radio transmitters from classroom electronics and coordinating resistance cells through codes based on their history lessons. But it was the underground war that truly broke coalition morale. Commander Alex Turner had taken a group of 300 humans and simply vanished beneath the Earth's surface. They lived in tunnel systems that predated human civilization, emerging only to strike at coalition supply lines before fading back into the darkness. Turner's people could survive for months without surface contact, living off stored supplies and underground water sources. They had turned the planet itself into a weapon. Coalition forces would secure a region only to find their equipment sabotaged overnight. Supply convoys would be attacked by fighters who seemed to appear from solid rock and disappear just as quickly. Communication arrays would be destroyed by explosions that came from below ground through tunnel systems that coalition engineers swore were impossible to dig with primitive human technology. The psychological effect was devastating. Coalition soldiers who had conquered dozens of worlds began reporting something their species had never experienced before: fear of the dark. They could not sleep knowing that humans might be moving through tunnels beneath their feet. They could not trust any piece of ground, any building, any apparently empty landscape. The humans were not fighting to win in any conventional sense. They were fighting to make conquest so expensive in time, resources, and lives that the coalition would abandon the effort entirely. Every day, the occupation continued. More coalition ships were needed to maintain supply lines. More troops were required to hold territory. More resources had to be diverted from other conquests to feed the endless demand of trying to control a population that refused to be controlled. After 6 months of occupation, the coalition controlled less territory than they had after the first week. Human resistance was not decreasing over time. It was growing stronger. Vexthai looked at the young cadets and saw his own younger self reflected in their confused expressions. They could not understand how a primitive species could stand against the might of the galaxy's greatest military force. Neither had he, until he learned the truth about what humans really were. Vexthai's mandibles clicked nervously as he continued his tale. The cadets could see that whatever came next had affected the old warrior in ways that physical battle never could. His forearms trembled slightly as he recalled events that had broken something fundamental in the coalition's understanding of warfare. The humans had been fighting the coalition for 8 months when something changed. The physical resistance continued, but the coalition forces began experiencing attacks on something they had not known could be targeted. The humans had begun waging war on their minds. It started with broadcasts. Coalition ships throughout the system began receiving transmissions on frequencies that should have been impossible for primitive human technology to access. These were not the usual demands for surrender or threats of retaliation that conquered species sometimes attempted. Instead, the humans began telling stories. The first transmission came from a human female who identified herself as Dr. Susan Beck. She was not a military commander or political leader. She was a historian. Her voice was calm and steady as she spoke directly to coalition soldiers across the fleet. She told them about a place called Thermopylae. Dr. Beck described how 300 human warriors had once stood against an army of thousands. They had known they could not win. They had known they would all die. But they had fought anyway, not for victory, but to buy time for others to prepare. They had held a narrow mountain pass for 3 days against impossible odds, and their sacrifice had inspired their entire civilization to resist conquest. The coalition soldiers listening to this transmission did not understand why they were being told ancient human history, but something about the story bothered them. These humans had fought knowing they would lose. They had chosen death over surrender even when surrender would have saved their lives. The broadcasts continued every day, Dr. Beck told them about human wars throughout history. She described battles where small groups had held against overwhelming numbers. She spoke of sieges that had lasted for years. She recounted tales of humans who had fought on when any rational being would have given up. But it was not the content of the stories that disturbed coalition forces. It was the way Dr. Beck told them. Her voice never showed fear or anger or desperation. She spoke like someone discussing historical facts that were already decided. She talked about human resistance as if it were as natural and inevitable as gravity. The psychological effect on coalition soldiers was unprecedented. These warriors had conquered dozens of worlds by following a simple pattern. Arrive with overwhelming force. Demonstrate superior technology. Wait for the local population to recognize the futility of resistance. Accept their surrender. Move on to the next target. But humans did not follow the pattern. They seemed genuinely confused by the concept of surrender. When coalition forces captured human prisoners, the interrogations revealed something that should not have been possible. The humans did not understand why anyone would stop fighting just because the odds were against them. One prisoner, a human male named Carl Rodriguez, was brought before Vextai for questioning. Carl had been captured after holding a communications post alone for 12 hours against an entire coalition company. He had been wounded 7 times, but had continued transmitting resistance coordinates until his equipment was finally destroyed. Vextai expected to find a broken enemy ready to cooperate in exchange for medical treatment. Instead, Carl looked him directly in the eyes and smiled the same disturbing smile that Jake Martinez had shown months earlier. When Vextai demanded information about human resistance networks, Carl gave an answer that would haunt coalition forces for years to come. "You can kill us," Carl said calmly, "but you can never break us. And eventually, you'll realize that makes this war unwinnable." The interrogation continued for hours. Carl answered some questions about human military capabilities, but every response contained the same underlying message. Humans would rather die than submit. They would rather see their cities destroyed than accept occupation. They would rather fight to extinction than live under foreign rule. What disturbed Vextai most was that Carl was not trying to be defiant or brave. He was simply stating facts as he understood them. The idea of surrendering to save his life had literally never occurred to him. The psychological contamination spread through coalition forces like a plague. Soldiers who had served faithfully for decades began questioning orders for the first time in their lives. Veterans who had conquered worlds without hesitation started experiencing something that most coalition species had never known: doubt about the righteousness of their cause. The humans seemed to generate some kind of field that infected everything around them with their irrational determination. Coalition medical officers reported increasing cases of what humans called nightmares. Soldiers would wake from sleep cycles reporting visions of endless human resistance. They dreamed of fighting enemies who would never surrender, never retreat, never accept defeat. But the worst psychological attack came from an unexpected source. A human female named Nancy Lewis had somehow gained access to coalition military communication networks. Intelligence officers insisted this was impossible. Human computer technology was centuries behind coalition standards. Their encryption systems were primitive. Their network security was laughable. Nancy Lewis did not care what was supposed to be impossible. Using nothing but human computers and mathematical techniques that coalition scientists did not recognize, she began feeding false information into coalition tactical systems. Supply ships would receive orders to deliver materials to locations that did not exist. Ground forces would be directed to attack positions that their own allies were occupying. Naval units would be given coordinates that sent them into asteroid fields. When coalition intelligence finally traced the source of the false orders, they found Nancy Lewis working from a basement laboratory that looked like something from a human history museum. Her equipment was so primitive that Coalition scanners had not even recognized it as computer technology. When they asked her how she had penetrated military-grade encryption systems, Nancy simply replied that humans had been hacking things for fun long before they had reached the stars. She explained that Coalition security was designed to stop sophisticated attacks from advanced civilizations. It was not prepared for someone who approached the problem like a puzzle to be solved rather than a barrier to be overcome. The discovery that one human civilian had been manipulating Coalition military operations for weeks created panic throughout the command structure. If their most secure systems could be compromised by primitive technology operated by a single individual, what other assumptions about human capabilities might be wrong? Vexthai paused in his narrative and looked at each of the young cadets, in turn. They were staring at him with expressions of disbelief and growing horror. "You think I am exaggerating?" he said quietly. "You think no species could be as irrational as I describe? But that was our mistake. We kept assuming that humans would eventually behave logically. We kept waiting for them to accept reality and surrender." The old warrior's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We never understood that for humans, the willingness to die for. An abstract concept like freedom was not insanity. It was the most logical thing in the universe." Vexthai's voice became almost reverent as he continued, but there was something else there now. Something that might have been fear mixed with a kind of terrible respect. The cadets leaned forward as the old warrior prepared to reveal the truth. That had changed everything the Coalition thought they knew about intelligent life. The Coalition High Command had reached a breaking point after 10 months of fighting humans. Their forces were demoralized. Their supply lines were constantly under attack. Their most secure communication systems had been compromised by primitive human technology. Something was fundamentally wrong with their understanding of this species, and they needed answers. The Science Division was ordered to conduct detailed studies of captured human prisoners. The goal was simple: discover what made these creatures so different from every other species the Coalition had encountered. Find their weakness. Learn how to break their irrational resistance to superior force. Dr. Zethkar, the Coalition's leading xenobiologist, was placed in charge of the research program. He had studied over 200 different species during his career. He understood the biological and psychological patterns that governed intelligent life throughout the galaxy. He was confident that humans would follow the same basic rules as every other creature they had cataloged. The first human brought for study was Dr. Kevin Wright, a xenobiologist who had been captured during a raid on a human research facility. The Coalition scientists expected him to be terrified and cooperative, eager to save his life by sharing information about human weaknesses. Instead, Dr. Kevin Wright seemed genuinely curious about his captors. He asked questions about Coalition biology. He wanted to know about their home worlds and evolutionary history. He discussed human research into alien life forms as if he were attending an academic conference rather than being held prisoner by an occupying army. When Dr. Zethkar began his examination procedures, Kevin Wright offered to explain human physiology in detail if it would help with the research. The initial findings were disturbing enough. Human bone density was nearly twice that of most Coalition species. Their muscle fiber was structured in ways that allowed for bursts of strength that should have been impossible for their body size. Their cardiovascular system could function under conditions that would kill most galactic civilizations within minutes. But it was when Dr. Zethkar began studying human evolutionary history that the real horror became clear. Kevin Wright explained that Earth was not like other worlds that had produced intelligent life. Most species evolved on planets where survival was possible through cooperation with the environment. They developed intelligence to better understand and adapt to stable conditions. Humans had evolved on what they casually referred to as a death world. Everything on Earth had been trying to kill humans for millions of years. The planet itself seemed designed to eliminate life through ice ages that lasted for millennia, volcanic eruptions that could darken the sky for decades, and natural disasters that struck without warning. The other creatures sharing their world were predators that could crush human bones with a single bite, or venomous animals that could kill with a touch. Under such conditions, most species would have either gone extinct or retreated to small, safe areas where they could hide from the dangers around them. Humans had done neither. Instead, they had developed the most terrifying survival trait that Dr. Zethkar had ever encountered. They had learned to hunt. Kevin Wright described how early humans had killed creatures many times their size and strength through a technique they called persistence hunting. They would chase their prey across vast distances, not trying to catch it immediately, but simply following it relentlessly. The prey animal would run until exhausted, then rest while the humans continued approaching. The cycle would repeat for days until the target finally collapsed from exhaustion and could no longer flee. Humans had evolved to be the ultimate persistence predator. They could not run faster than most animals, but they could run longer than anything else on their planet. They could not kill large prey with their natural weapons, but they could follow it until it died of exhaustion. They had developed the psychological ability to pursue a goal for days, weeks, months, or even years without giving up. Dr. Zethkar realized with growing horror that this evolutionary trait had not disappeared when humans developed technology and civilization. It had simply been redirected toward other targets. The same mental programming that allowed early humans to chase prey animals to death was now focused on abstract concepts like freedom and independence. Humans were literally incapable of giving up once they had decided something was worth pursuing. The research team made another discovery that chilled coalition leadership to their core. Kevin Wright explained that human history was filled with examples of smaller groups defeating larger ones through simple refusal to surrender. Humans had a concept called asymmetric warfare that they had been practicing for thousands of years. They understood intuitively that a weaker force could defeat a stronger one by making victory too expensive to achieve. They would trade their lives at ratios that made no mathematical sense, accepting massive casualties to inflict smaller losses on their enemies, because they knew that eventually the stronger force would decide the cost was too high and withdraw. But the most terrifying revelation came when Dr. Zethkar asked about human attitudes toward their own extinction. Kevin Wright paused thoughtfully before answering, as if the question had never occurred to him before. Then he explained something that violated every principle of evolutionary biology that the coalition understood. Humans had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet. They called this concept mutually assured destruction. If faced with complete conquest by a superior force, they would rather trigger these weapons and eliminate both themselves and their enemies than accept subjugation. They had actually built the means to commit species suicide and were prepared to use it rather than surrender their freedom. Dr. Zethkar's report to the Coalition High Command contained a single conclusion that shattered everything they thought they knew about intelligent life. Humans were not behaving irrationally. Their resistance was not based on emotion or ignorance or primitive thinking. They were following evolutionary programming that had been refined over millions of years of survival on a planet that had tried to kill them every single day. Their willingness to fight to extinction was not a flaw in their logic. It was the most logical response their species could make based on their evolutionary history. A human philosopher named Daniel Foster, when questioned about human nature, had put it in terms that haunted coalition leadership. He explained that humans had learned through millions of years of evolution that there were things worse than death. Living as prey was worse than dying as a hunter. Accepting subjugation was worse than fighting for freedom, even if that fight led to extinction. Vexthai looked at the young cadets and saw his own younger self reflected in their horrified expressions. They were beginning to understand what he had learned on Earth. The Coalition had not encountered another intelligent species. They had encountered something that should not exist in a rational universe. They had found a species that would rather die free than live as slaves. and that made them absolutely unstoppable. Vexthai's voice became barely audible as he approached the final part of his tale. His forearms rested heavily on the table, and the scars across his gray skin seemed to pulse with remembered pain. The cadets sat in absolute silence, knowing they were about to hear something that would change their understanding of warfare forever. The Coalition High Command had spent weeks studying the reports from the Science Division. The truth about human evolution and psychology had created panic in the highest levels of government. These creatures were not just another species to be conquered. They were something that should not exist in a rational universe. But the Coalition had invested too much to simply withdraw. 2 million soldiers were on or near Earth. Hundreds of ships were committed to the campaign. The resources spent on this invasion could have conquered 50 normal worlds. Pride and practical considerations demanded one final attempt to break human resistance. The decision was made to target civilian population centers. Every previous species had surrendered when faced with massive civilian casualties. The Coalition leadership believed that humans, despite their strange psychology, would still follow this basic pattern when confronted with the deaths of their non-combatant population. They chose a city called Chicago as their target. Intelligence. Reports suggested that Chicago was a major population center with no significant military value. Over 3 million humans lived there, most of them engaged in non-military activities. The destruction of such a city would demonstrate Coalition power while avoiding direct confrontation with human military forces. The orbital bombardment of Chicago began at dawn on a clear spring day. The Coalition fleet targeted the city with precision strikes designed to maximize civilian casualties while leaving infrastructure intact for future use. They expected the human government to contact them within hours, offering unconditional surrender in exchange for ending the attacks on innocent people. No surrender offer came. Instead, something happened that Coalition commanders had not anticipated. The destruction of Chicago did not break human resistance. It awakened something primal and terrible in the entire human species. Within hours of the bombardment, every human military unit across the planet received the same message from their High Command. The time for defensive warfare was over. Chicago would be avenged. The Coalition forces would be driven from human space entirely, and humanity would ensure that no alien species would ever again threaten Earth. General Patricia Moore took command of what humans called Operation Reckoning. Moore had been a defensive coordinator throughout the occupation, organizing resistance cells and guerrilla attacks. But the destruction of Chicago transformed her from a resistance leader into something far more dangerous. She became the commander of a species that had decided to stop playing by the rules of civilized warfare. The human counterattack began immediately and followed no pattern that Coalition forces could understand or counter. Human ships that had been fleeing Coalition patrols suddenly turned and began hunting them across the solar system. Damaged vessels that should have been limping toward repair facilities instead rammed themselves into Coalition supply ships. Civilian craft loaded with improvised explosives sought out targets of opportunity among the invasion fleet. But it was not the change in human naval tactics that terrified Coalition forces. It was the transformation of human ground troops. Steve Jackson was a pilot whose fighter had been damaged during the initial stages of Operation Reckoning. His engines were failing, his weapon systems were offline, and his life support was running on emergency power. Coalition protocols would have called for him to eject and attempt to reach friendly territory. Instead, Steve Jackson aimed his dying fighter at a Coalition fuel depot and transmitted a message that would echo through Coalition command centers for years to come. "This is for Chicago," he said calmly. "Earth remembers." The explosion that followed destroyed not only the fuel depot, but also 3 Coalition supply ships that had been docked nearby. Steve Jackson had traded his life for a tactical victory that conventional weapons could not have achieved. But he was not alone. Across the planet, Human forces began adopting tactics that violated every principle of military engagement that the coalition understood. They treated their own lives as ammunition to be expended for maximum effect against enemy targets. They turned every piece of equipment, every vehicle, every structure into potential weapons against the occupation force. Colonel Amy Rodriguez led ground forces that moved through coalition installations like a force of nature. Her troops did not try to capture territory or hold defensive positions. They moved constantly, striking at supply depots, communication centers, and command posts before disappearing into the civilian population. But Rodriguez and her forces followed rules that coalition commanders could not comprehend. They destroyed everything related to the military occupation while carefully protecting civilian aliens who had been brought to Earth as support staff. They targeted coalition war materials while leaving medical supplies and food distribution centers untouched. They were not fighting a war of conquest or revenge. They were fighting a war of liberation with surgical precision. The psychological effect on coalition forces was devastating. These warriors had spent their careers following predictable patterns of occupation and resistance. Humans broke every rule they understood about how intelligent species were supposed to behave during wartime. Coalition soldiers found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to grow more dangerous the more desperate their situation became. Human forces cut off from supply lines became more aggressive rather than seeking surrender. Human units that suffered heavy casualties fought harder rather than retreating to regroup. After 18 months of what should have been a simple occupation, coalition forces controlled less territory than they had after the first week of invasion. Tuxa. Final transmission that coalition forces received from Earth came from Lieutenant Billy Murphy, a human communications officer working from a bunker beneath the ruins of what had once been Chicago. His message was simple and delivered in the same calm tone that had characterized human broadcasts throughout the conflict. "We know you're out there," Murphy said. "We know you might come back someday. We'll be ready when you do. We'll always be ready." The coalition withdrawal from Earth was completed within 6 months of Operation Reckoning. The official records classified the Terran conflict as a failed colonization attempt due to unexpected resistance from primitive technology and guerrilla tactics. The truth was classified at the highest levels of government and shared only with senior military commanders as a warning. The coalition had encountered something that challenged their basic understanding of intelligent life. They had found a species that became more dangerous when threatened with extinction rather than more willing to surrender. They had discovered creatures that valued abstract concepts like freedom more than their own survival. Vexthai looked at the young cadets and saw the same confusion and fear that he had felt when he first realized the truth about humans. The coalition established a permanent quarantine zone around Earth, he said quietly. "We monitor their system from a safe distance. We watch for signs of human expansion into nearby star systems. And we pray to whatever gods we believe in that they never decide to come looking for us." The old warrior stood slowly, his battle scars visible in the dim light of the briefing room. "If you ever encounter humans in battle," he said with absolute seriousness, "remember this above all else. They are not like us. They do not fight for glory or conquest or even survival. They fight for something they call freedom, and they would rather die than lose it." He paused at the door and looked back at the cadets one final time. "That makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy.